Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. I'm Jen Gerson, and today I have with me Heather Exner-Pirot. She is the Director of Energy and Natural Resources and Environment at the MacDonald-Laurier Institute. She is going to check some of my rampant New Year's doomerism here on this podcast today. We have a great conversation coming up for you. I hope you enjoy it. We're going to talk Venezuela. We're going to talk about Canada. We're going to talk about the United States. It's all right up your alley. That's today on the Line. Well, hello, Heather, and thank you for joining us on the Line. I appreciate you taking time out of your day. Are you in Calgary with me?
I am just right outside in Bragg Creek. There's a little bit more snow.
Okay, so you have water then.
Yes, we do have water.
That's nice.
I've been on the opposite ends of that, so glad that we're the ones with water this time.
Fantastic. Well, all I can say is if I need to, I may decide to show up at your house for a shower if it comes to it. So just
You'll
be warned.
Behind the light of my sister, but yes, you're welcome to.
Fantastic. All right, so you're on the podcast today because we want to talk energy and we want to talk geopolitics and Venezuela. We want to talk Venezuela. I got to be honest with you, as someone who feels like she's been screaming into the void of doomerism when it comes to Donald Trump and the collapse of the global world order and the implications this is going to have for Canada, and I generally get the sense that people think that I'm a crazy doomer. It seems to me like this is the abduction of Nicholas Maduro, the head of Venezuela, seems to be the thing that finally has woken people up. And has actually kind of enlightened them to the fact that no, things are actually different now. Things are changing in ways that we can't predict, and there are going to be implications for that. Why is it this thing? Why is this the thing that seems to have jarred people so deeply of all the things that have happened in the last year and a half?
I mean, great question. And I guess in hindsight, we'll all look at the things in the last year and a half maybe a little bit differently or a bit more skeptically. But for me, I woke up to the news of Maduro thinking, good, you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
That initial reaction, and it was, an impressive operation. And pretty much every single thing that has come out of the administration since that time has gone kind of further and further dark. And it does feel this week like the Americans are not the good guys.
Which is great when we're comparing them to Maduro. That's a low bar to be setting.
Yeah, I mean, Maduro is also a bad guy, but, it was like, oh, great, we're going to have regime change. And it was like, no, we're not going to have regime change. And it was, and then, I was reading Autocracy Inc. at the that's,
perfect timing.
Really last weekend.
Yeah.
It's perfect. And my husband is a skeptic. I'm sure a lot of our Alberta husbands are skeptics, with Shaney and Halliburton or Carney or Brookfield, he'll go to the dark side on that. And he was like, oh, Trump is going to make all that Venezuelan money. And I was like, I think that might be what Trump wants to do here. And then he made that crazy announcement that, they're going to take 30 to 50 million barrels and he's going to control it and it'll be in an offshore account. And that for me was like, wow, we have really gone, we've crossed something here. And then the Greenland stuff just, wildly insane and has bothered me for a long time.
Okay, so this is interesting because it's not like the idea of the U.S. intervening in Latin America is new. I mean, I believe I read something from The Atlantic that says that they've intervened in various forms of regime change or Latin American politics like 42 times. This is not a new thing for the U.S. to sort of put its finger in the pie of a South American country, or seeing the South American country as kind of within its sphere of influence or its backyard. So let's break down what about this is shocking and new, because I think part of it is that there's no attempt to create a moral or democratic justification for it. That is new.
That's the newest thing. And even in the Middle East, when they went into Iraq, even you're kind of like, I think that's about oil, but, they said it was about democracy and regime change. And obviously everything in the 80s in Latin America was ostensibly about also kind of ridding the, the hemisphere of communism.
Sure.
And so at least that was, Reaganism, kind of the good side. And this time, again, they're saying it out loud. Like you can't, this is about the natural resources and we're going to control all of it. and we'll decide how much they get, but we're controlling the money. They're a vassal state. We're going to run it for a long time, and they can only use that money to buy other American products. Like, these are all things that senior officials in the administration has said this week. So it's about using their power to get their way. It's brazen.
And I think that there was actually a really interesting piece about The Atlantic about this. It's not a virtue to say, well, at least they're not being hypocritical, or at least they're not lying about it, because the story that that Americans tell themselves about who they are and what kind of actions they choose to play in the world, it matters. It matters that they believe that they're the good guys when they intervene in Iraq. And even if you want to talk about the interference of oil of Iraq, they did engage in a massive nation building attempt that failed ultimately. They did sacrifice real American lives. So there was a kind of virtuous pretext to their choice to be in that unfortunate war. And an America that is unshackled by even hypocritical virtues is an America that is a much more terrifying thing than an America that is at least bound by some kind of self-restraint. I think that's the thing for me.
I totally agree that we've definitely, crossed a threshold this week, and Donald Trump at least seems intent on using his power to get the things that he wants. Again, not to preserve some set of values or principles or philosophies, but to primarily enrich himself and his network. These are things that they are saying. We're far beyond that this is a conspiracy theory, or you're skeptical, or it's Trump derangement syndrome. This is what they're saying they're doing.
Okay, and I want to get into the implications for this for Canada, and I think that's going to make up the bulk of our conversation. But first, there's two things that I wanted to flag, and that is, this isn't regime change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and I think that was maybe the pretext, and even some conservatives cheered, that became obviously a bit contentious, cheered the removal of Maduro. And I think for a month we've been seeing, obviously they've put some forces around Venezuela, and you kind of saw that, it's certainly threatening to do that, and then they did it. But that was the first signal for me that this was not what we were hoping for when this was not the
removal of Maduro, stolen election in order to have another election that will be democratic and freely and fairly fought.
Yeah, when they're maybe like, the vice president will run it now. We'll run it, but the vice president will be there to do our bidding in the meantime. Yeah. And that is, and we'll get into why Venezuela is not a real competitor for Canadian oil, but it is a country that has been racked by corruption and violence and poor governance for a long time. And now you're saying that we're not even going to try to change that system. There's not a single boot on the ground. There's not a plan to change all of that. We just think we're a bigger dog, and that we can, that we will have more power to use that corruption and violence and poor governance.
Yeah, we're just so long as we're making the corruption and violence work for us, we don't give a shit.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And that was, we talked about that in Latin America in the 20th century. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Right.
And we're right back to that.
So the other question that I have, and this comes from my comment section, to what extent is China a factor here?
Well, I mean, and again, I think it's fascinating. I think what Trump wanted out of Venezuela, what Marco Rubio wanted Venezuela, what J.D. Vance wanted out of Venezuela are all different things. Mm-hmm. And I think there is, still a virtuous corner of the State Department or the Department of War that, was looking basically at, there were absolutely bad actors in Venezuela. And they were working with China and Iran in ways that, undermine, and Russia that probably undermine the liberal world order, if we still care about that, which I do.
What liberal world order? That was nice. That was a liberal order. It was a nice idea.
I remember it fondly. And anyways, and then Venezuela, and obviously Venezuela's leverage, or why it rose to any kind of prominence in that kind of unholy alliance, was because it has oil resources. Mm-hmm. And China started to, which will become interesting for Canada, China started to invest in heavy oil refining capabilities, knowing that it had that source coming out of Venezuela. Anyway, so now they've been cut off, China, of Venezuela. I think they'll be mad. Like, we haven't seen the reaction from China yet. And I'd be surprised if they just did nothing. And so that's something fun to look forward to, the Chinese reaction to all of this. But anyways, this will raise questions about Canada. Obviously, right now we're just moving barrels around. You know, if Venezuelan heavy oil barrels are now going to the Gulf Coast, Canadian heavy oil barrels will just go somewhere else, the same amount of heavy oil barrels in the world. And obviously, they're going to start to move to China. Carney's going to China this week. And it remains to be seen what the American reaction, if any, will be to that. I'm guessing it's not nothing, because the philosophical justification for all this was to rid the Western Hemisphere of these adversaries.
Okay, so let's talk about the oil situation in Venezuela, because I think that people need to understand this. How much oil is Venezuela producing daily? How much of that is eaten up by domestic consumption, so not for export? And how does that compare with Canada's export capacity at present? Where do these players sit on the oil production food chain right now?
Yeah, great question. And so for some of your viewers who don't know, the reason why Canada and Venezuela are being, compared is because we're both heavy oil producers. Right. And most of global trade is in light oil. Light oil is easier to refine. You don't need as complex refineries to process light oil, and it produces a bit more gasoline. Heavy oil produces a few more other products. And Canada is the world's top heavy oil producer. But Venezuela also has huge reserves. We have huge reserves. There are in heavy oil also. So that's why there's competition. And a lot of the Gulf Coast refineries, when they were set up in the 70s as a response to OPEC and the embargo that happened after the Yom Kippur War, were optimized to accept that Venezuelan oil. That was an alternative source of Middle Eastern oil for them at that time. And so Venezuela has had as much as about 3.5 million barrels. But after Hugo Chavez came into power, that obviously declined. They nationalized industry, kicked out, multinational corporations. Obviously, investment collapsed. Sanctions have been applied. And so I've heard a number of different numbers. I think 800,000 is probably the most reasonable of what they're exporting. They've probably dropped a couple 100,000 just in the last month because they've had to shut down production. But in general, you would think that they have, between 800,000 and 1 million barrels that they're producing. Again, some of them they're using it themselves. Most of it they're exporting. And Canada exports about 4.5 million barrels.
Where does that heavy oil from Venezuela go to right now?
So it was mostly going to China, but I think it's important also to say that it wasn't China's biggest source of oil. It was just a big source of heavy oil. Right. And all in all, before this happened, Venezuela is only accounting for less than 1% of global oil production. Right. And that's why the stocks are one thing, but the oil market hasn't been too spooked because it just wasn't that big of a player anymore in terms of production. But a lot of it was going to Venezuela. It was going to Cuba. I imagine India was taking some because of sanctioned barrels that you could get for cheaper. But it obviously, and some of that Chevron oil. So Chevron's the last American company that's still operating. I understand they did about 240,000 barrels a day was their operation, and they had at some times and most recently kind of a permit to sell that into the United States.
Okay, so and what's preventing Venezuela from producing its full capacity, 3.5 to 4 million? So about the same amount as what we export.
Yeah, and this is why, where all of this is like, oh, Venezuela's going to take over all of Canadian oil. We're screwed. Like, people don't appreciate how hard it is to produce oil.
Yeah, there seems to be a weird sort of Beverly Hillbillies kind of mentality about oil. It's like, oh, you just shoot it in the ground, it comes out. Yeah. Like, that's all it is. That's not even really true with light oil. It's certainly not true with heavy crude.
Well, that's a very good distinction. So exactly to that point. And I think in Alberta and Canada, we should at least appreciate what it took to get the oil sands up and, ramped up by a couple million barrels. And that was, as we know, well over $100 billion of investment in that nice time, kind of between 2010 and 2014 when we ramped up. The last greenfield project was in 2014 in the oil sands, and they've just been incrementally producing more barrels then. But heavy oil is heavy, so it's harder to coax out of the ground. Here in Canada, we have to heat it, we steam it to get it out. In Venezuela, they have a different process, but it still comes out quite heavy, quite sticky, and they need to blend it and dilute it to be able to get it to flow. But any oil operation is going to be heavy on physical infrastructure. And the world has been quite well supplied in oil for the last decade because of the shale revolution in the United States. So prices have been reasonably low. They're very low right now at about $57 a barrel. And
well, let's just quickly put a pin in that, because I think that's an important thing for people to understand. The shale revolution in the United States effectively made the United States energy independent, even from Canadian oil. That's still true, right?
That's not quite true, because they needed heavy oil still. They were independent for light oil, and they actually export some light that they don't have an ability to refine.
Okay.
They had to have some heavy oil in the mix because their refinery system was built for that.
Right. So that's so they couldn't totally just retool the refineries just for light oil. They needed to have some heavy oil, so therefore they do actually need Canadian oil. But if we're just looking in terms of like barrels produced versus barrels consumed domestically in the United States, they're more or less fine.
Yeah,
like if they were to retool all their refineries for light oil, they could supply their own oil internally, even
just
without
about.
us.
They're still
just about. Okay.
They're still marginally a net crude oil importer, but mostly self-sufficient. They're the world's largest producer, and they're a net exporter on natural gas for sure through LNG. So on the natural gas side and the liquid side, they're net exporters. But they didn't retool, Jen, because it's just too expensive to retool even in that time. And now we see shale is peaking, so they certainly won't be retooling for light crude when they expect that the light crude supplies will start to decrease.
Okay, so is part of the reason why they might be interested in Venezuela because that shale oil supply is peaking?
Well, I'm a political scientist. So I saw this, I've often commented, I've written, and it's obvious. The United States went into Iraq in 2003. And then they haven't, in Afghanistan, but they used to go into the Middle East quite a bit. There used to be a lot of Middle Eastern wars. And if you're wondering why after 2008 that stops, is because they didn't need the oil as much anymore. To your point, they had the shale revolution, technological advancements in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling that unleashed a lot of the hydrocarbons that they had and made it very, profitable and economic. And so I think it is very interesting timing. We've all been anticipating the peak of that shale production. It looks like maybe this is the quarter where it's actually happening, where you start to see some decline. These are non-renewable resources. It's getting gassier. So we know physically how it's happening, not just economically. And that is, the quarter that the United States invades a different country.
Just a coincidence, I'm sure. Yeah.
And obviously, it's not going to be a flush. I think if you were smart in the Department of Energy, you would be saying, what are we going to do in 3 and 5 and 10 years? That is, right now it's plateaued and they still produce a lot, but it's in 3 and 5 and 10 years where it really starts to hit. And that's maybe where Venezuelan kind of medium term, could meet some of that demand and does make a little bit of sense. And I also think that's why Trump was so obsessed with Canada and Canadian oil a year ago. I think he went in saying, drill, baby, drill. And eventually someone said to him, we are not going to drill, baby, drill anymore in the United States. We're peaked and it's not going to be economic at these prices anymore. And then he started looking at Canada.
The 51st state started to be a whole thing.
That is when the 51st state thing happened. And then he got, annoyed with us and doesn't want to have to deal with us. And now Venezuela. I mean, I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think that's pretty direct line.
It's pretty direct thing. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Venezuela here, because I think it is pertinent to the conversation in Canada, but I think people need to understand the context of Venezuela. Venezuela can't just turn on a switch and start producing 3 million more barrels per day. Like that's not the reality right now. What is the reality right now in Venezuela, and what kind of work and investment needs to be done in Venezuela to get it to the place where it could actually be supplying a significant amount of global oil, presumably to the United States.
Right. So right now, the very lowest hanging fruit is what Venezuela already had in storage and on tankers that maybe were sanctioned and were on water. And so when Trump talks about those 30 to 50 million barrels, and there's some skepticism that's even that amount, but it's just what they've already produced and was sitting there that they couldn't sell. So that can, but that's not a flooding of the market. I have to say, the world consumes over 100 million barrels a day. So even that is, let's say 11
half
hours.
A day's, yeah, exactly. It's half a day's oil.
So again, markets are not spooked and still take time to filter those to heavy crude refineries, yada, yada, yada. So that's the very, very short term. I would say in the next few months, there is the possibility, that Chevron could, for example, ramp up some of its operations. They could get some diluents that was lacking and blend it with some of the heavy oil and maybe get another, let's say like low couple 100,000 of barrels, in the coming months, if everything went well. But to get anything more than that, when you want to start to get up, like meaningfully adding 1 million barrels. Again, now we're talking about billions. Lots of people say tens of billions. If you're talking about 1 million barrels, tens of billions. And that's how much it costs. If you wanted to add a million barrels in Canada, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars of upstream investment. Right. So it is very expensive. And so, if you wanted to add, let's say, get up to 2 or 3 million barrels, so we're talking about over $100 billion of investment. And if everything went well, it's certainly into the mid 2030s.
Okay, so this also help me visualize this because I can visualize the oil sands. I know what those look like. Help me visualize Venezuelan crude. Is it in a pocket in the earth? Is it in sand in the same way that it's in Alberta? Like what exactly is it? Where is it?
And I'm a political scientist, but I'll tell you what I do know is a lot of it is in that Orinoco belt. I think a lot of it is offshore. And that just adds some more logistical constraints or need for different kinds of investment.
And the reason why I guess I'm asking about this technical thing is because my mom was an advisor at Shell. She was like a technical crude advisor at Shell. Yeah. And so she's like trying to explain all this to me. And she's like, Venezuelan crude has a really high sulfur content. So you actually need to like dilute it in order to process it and refine it properly. And you need to like totally, I'm like, picture this for me. Like paint a picture of this for me. Okay. So in order to get Venezuela to be competitive with Canadian oil in the American market, and let's not even look at the rest of the world for half a minute here, we're talking tens of billions of dollars worth of investment, realistically, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment. They need to stabilize politically because a huge part of the reason why Venezuelan oil is shut in is because of decades and decades of political mismanagement. Yes. And time. Like, I don't think there's any way around the time in conversation. We're still talking 5, 7, 10 years before.
If everything goes well.
If everything goes well. I do
want to jump in as a political scientist. So there's lots of technical discussions and there is some discussion about how Venezuela would be a cheaper barrel. And why? Because it's already on water when you get it. And so to get to the Gulf refineries instead of having to go through pipeline is cheaper. It's expensive to go through pipeline that distance. But for me as a political scientist, like almost none of that matters because Venezuela right now is going to be practically a failed state. And there will be no one in power who has the credibility and the authority and the legitimacy. And there will be it is so hard to do business in a state that is corrupt. And that is deep part of the culture. And again, if the United States had come out, even in Iraq, they had a big plan and they were doing nation building. They had troops on the ground and they spent tens of billions of dollars into it. They don't even have like that. Like there's none of that. There's no plan for the United States to help, change the culture or create civil society or introduce regime change. It's literally the same people. And this is what, when you say, a barrel's $58. Well, a heavy crude barrel is probably $40, $45 a barrel. And people expect to get Venezuelan oil for cheaper than what they get a Canadian barrel. And now you have to produce that, so actually that eats up a lot of money to actually produce all that. But now Venezuela would want a peace, the government, all the gangs, kind of all the, the people that they're paying to maintain violence, to suppress the population. They all expect to get a peace. And now you're adding Trump expects a peace,
Mm-hmm.
and all the American oil multinationals expect a return on investment, and also maybe some compensation for what has already been expropriated over the last 10, 15 years. There's a lot of palms that need to be greased out of that $45 barrel. And in the last week, I've heard a lot about how people want to make money off of Venezuelan oil. I haven't heard a single story of someone putting money into Venezuelan oil.
Mm.
And there's only so much, the other thing about oil is it depletes. You have to constantly reinvest. And so if you just maintain the status quo and you're not reinvesting, you will get less production, next year and the year after. And this is not a situation where any private capital, it would be crazy, to enter into the situation right now, unless you think
unless they have to.
Corruption.
Well, or unless they're strong armed into it. Like, hey, ExxonMobil, you like those permits? Where's
Exxon has many options. They are a publicly traded company. They have a board. They have shareholders. It's even hard to, unless they want to be corrupt and do side deals. I mean, okay, maybe
I'm not even talking about corruption and side deals. I'm just saying, like, if the Trump White House goes to, say, ExxonMobil or Chevron and says, you invest a third of your annual profits of I think ExxonMobil is pulling in $30 billion a year in profit. So the Trump White House says, this is an American-based company. You invest a third of your profits into increasing production in Venezuela over the next 10 years, or we're going to make life difficult for you. It's not hard for me to make a case as an ExxonMobil executive to my shareholders and say, the business case in Venezuela is highly suspect. But if we don't do this, being offside with the Trump administration for as long as there's going to be a Trump administration, and we don't know how long that is, that is a higher risk to me than throwing $10 billion a year into Venezuela.
I don't think so. And I think Trump now has already said, we'll subsidize if we need to. Because I think he heard what we just said, and his response, well, we'll subsidize or they'll get paid out of revenues. So now you're in a situation. So now this is the other side of the politics, Jen. ExxonMobil also operates in the United States. So if you're saying we're going to use U.S. taxpayer dollars to subsidize these corporations to build and expand and direct their profits to Venezuelan oil production, so that they can go to my offshore account that the U.S. president controls. All this is very terrible for U.S. oil producers. They were already struggling at $58 a barrel. You already have been seeing rigs drop, and you've seen production drop. And now Trump wants $50 a barrel. There's not a lot in shale that will sustain itself at $50 a barrel. You are going to see collapse in shale production in the United States at those prices. And those are all red states. And usually the oil and gas industry is a pretty powerful lobby, but also red states are pretty powerful. And it's the congressional midterms that are coming up, where all these red state congressmen, where there's losing jobs and losing revenues in their districts, are going to be facing re-election. So there is a tremendous tension between what Trump is trying to do in Venezuela to lower prices and what is good for the U.S. oil and gas industry, and therefore many red states in the South where his mega base would otherwise be.
I'm not convinced that's going to matter. I'm really not. And the reason why I keep on saying this is because I think there's a lot of very rational analysis that's rooted in the idea that America will reject Trump if, the economy is going to shit. And what I think that in normal times, in normal cases, that's probably true. That's absolutely true. What I think people are undermining is that perception of economy can be manipulated, and is being manipulated and will be manipulated. I think that if Trump convinces his base that the economy is better off than it was before, the actual economic indicators aren't going to matter, right? And the actual bit, I'm not sure how much, as much as I think there are a lot of red state senators who are feeling the pressure from oil lobbies in Oklahoma and Texas and all the rest, I think that's true. I don't actually think that Trump's base gives a shit about the profitability of the oil sector. Like, I don't think they care.
No, it's the jobs. I mean, I think it's the jobs.
But no, and even if they're unemployed, they're not going to make that connection. They're not going to be like, I'm unemployed, and that's a direct response. That's a direct consequence of the Trump administration's actions. They're going to say, I'm unemployed. It's the Chinese's fault. You know what I mean? Or it's the Canadians' fault, or it's the Mexicans' fault that I'm unemployed, and Trump's doing everything he can for me. Hoorah. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not hard for me to see how he would craft that kind of fantasy narrative that gets him off the hook for the economic consequences of his own choices.
So I agree
that's real grim.
What he'll say, and that is one of the methods to its madness, is that he is trying to keep oil prices extremely low as his powers can allow it, ahead of the midterm elections. And the one bright spot I think that will say that people see and recognize is you're paying less than $2 a gallon for gas, and that's because of Trump. And that is true. That is actually true. But again, it's not good for oil producing sectors, and the rest of the economy is not doing well. Manufacturing is not doing well. And I think some Americans don't like being the bad guy, saw themselves, anyways, I guess we'll see in the midterms. Right now, if you're betting on it, in kind of the betting sites, is very heavily favored for the Democrats, even though they're still, in total shambles and don't seem to have their act together.
I have a horrific theory, and I don't think that I'm going to be able to prove or disprove this theory till after the midterms. But my horrific theory is, A, you can't trust the polling data. And my horrific theory is, like, Trump is giving the plurality of Americans exactly what they want. And the plurality of the reason why you can't trust the polling data is because the plurality of Americans who are going to vote for him aren't going to admit to that. Like, they like what they're seeing with ICE. They like what they're seeing with mass deportations. They like the fact that this guy just chopped Maduro's head off and are going to let the Venezuelans figure it out. We're not going to have to sacrifice a single American life in order to secure this oil supply. He's doing what they want. And he's appealing to their worst instincts, their basest, most shadow selves. And in the light of day, they're not going to own that to a pollster. They're not going to own that to their friends. But when they're behind closed doors, it's like, fuck yeah, hoorah. And I think that that's going to bear out, because I think there's a good chance that the Republicans are going to maintain at least the House or the Senate. That would be my theory.
I'm just more
no, that's fair. I'm in a really dark place, Heather. I'm in a really dark place.
Yeah. Let me also say, again, Maduro capture. Booyah. You know what I mean? Nobody on this podcast is going to defend Maduro. All right. Absolutely. But even in the United States, I think that was kind of fuck yeah, America. But almost every hour since then, the situation has gotten worse and more complicated. And I think it will be revealed, it is being revealed, that there was no plan. This is not going according to anyone thought. They may have to put boots on the ground there. And I also think this Venezuela thing, I think, a lot of people would be like, okay, Venezuela, I get it. They've been on that list for a long time. But Cuba, Greenland, Mexico, Colombia are being brought up now. I feel like a poor execution in Venezuela, which seems inevitable to me now, is going to also further undermine any appetite for each additional kind of intervention, even within the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, so I just think the public already didn't like it. You didn't even like the first part, according to polling, of the Maduro capture. Not, a lot of them didn't want all this regime change, world police stuff. And as it is revealed to be a disaster, I think all this kind of interventionism will look less and less popular.
But in a world where Trump is an evil magician who can craft the perception of his followers, is it going to be perceived by them as a disaster?
So this is what I think. And I'm surprised it didn't happen after the first term. But Trump is great TV, but he did get saturated. People were tired of the show. People were tired of the show by 2019, last time. And I feel like, again, they will get sick and tired of this. It won't be as entertaining. It will be obnoxious, and he'll
Well, no,
become
and he's got to keep on ratcheting up the show
He'll
every single
become the butt.
time.
Yes, well, I mean that's true, but I think he will become the butt of jokes, and I think it will become popular at some point. It'll be countercultural, popular on the right to criticize Donald Trump.
Yes, but then he's going to be replaced with something that appeals to that shadow instinct to an even greater degree.
Well,
and maybe more intelligently.
I mean, it is, in all of this, we can all, be concerned that there is a significant, I don't think it's, maybe a plurality. There's a significant portion of the United States that would like to invade Canada, that would like to take over Greenland, that would be very happy with all these things. And there's too many of them for Canada not to take that seriously, even if I don't think it's, won't happen, but there's 30 million that would love to do it tomorrow.
Well, I think that the odds that they're going to take over Greenland or effectively take over Greenland are pretty much 80% at this point. Like, I don't even think that's
not at all popular. Not at all popular.
It doesn't matter if it's popular.
I think he would be impeached after the midterms if he did that.
Again?
I think that because the Democrats will take over the House, especially if he takes over Greenland. I think there's enough Republican senators. There's already 7 or 8 that have come out and said, do not do this. And that would be enough in the Senate, even if Republicans maintain the Senate.
They're afraid. They're chicken shit. They're terrified.
At some point, because of the public support that Trump has had, is why they're terrified.
They're going to get shot if they openly oppose anything Trump does. That's what they're afraid of.
Republican senators have openly opposed. And they're being very careful how they couch it. They're blaming Stephen Miller, let's say, get Stephen Miller out of there.
Which is classic right out of communist Russia, by the way. Sending a letter to the Tsar, you may not be aware of what your ministers are doing.
Yeah, exactly. So
right?
They're being careful. But again, at some point, for me, it all depends on public approval for these things. And at some point, Trump may be a liability for some Republican districts. And that will be when some of them will be boldened. It'll be countercultural. I do think, I think there's a saying, I'm going to butcher it, that Churchill said, the United States always does the right thing after it's exhausted all the other possible options. I still think it'll come back to Jesus. After all this episode.
I think it's going to come back to Jesus. I just don't know if it's going to come back to Jesus by the midterms or by the time I'm dead. And also, I increasingly think that public opinion doesn't matter. I think what matters is power, and who has it and who doesn't. Everything else is and the power to shape perception is ultimately going to be the one that decides who holds the House or the Senate, and that's presuming the midterms even take place. I mean, you're looking, I'm sure, at the gerrymandering that's taking place in places like Texas and other states like that. I mean, they can rig this effectively.
I guess they could. I still think. I mean, we're going pretty dark rabbit holes here now. But I'm in
the bad place right now, Heather. I'm in the bad place.
Yeah, so I'm also.
So I appreciate you're trying to lift me out of the bad place. I really do.
Too. I've always thought, kind of intellectually thought through that option too. And I will see, looking at the Arctic, because that's obviously a place that I care about and think about. Mm-hmm. All the military exercises and all the military cooperation has still been excellent. And I think people who went into the U.S. military, a lot of them did care about being the good guys, and did care about upholding the Constitution, and were willing to sacrifice their lives for that. And so I still think. I still don't think, I still think the Constitution and democracy will be upheld in the United States, because I don't think what Trump is doing is attractive to people in the U.S. military.
So what I've talked about this with Matt before on the podcast about what kind of outcomes are possible and not possible, and how we analyze what's becoming more possible and what's becoming less possible. We don't try to make predictions. What I try to explain to people is there's a leaderboard of outcomes, and some of them are ordinary plausible outcomes, and some of them are really batshit crazy outcomes, and they're all on the leaderboard on a probability scale. And then events start to happen, and then things start to move up the leaderboard or down the leaderboard, right? And one of the big signs for me of something really catastrophic happening for Canada would be the collapse or the disintegration of the integrated military alliance between America and Canada. So we would see, for example, Canada and or America pull out of NORAD. Or just be like, fuck you. Like that to me would be one of those signs that something is either happened or about to happen that radically changes the world order as we know it. And that hasn't happened yet. You're right. Like that. That's why some of the really more outlandish scenarios that I play with at the dark of night, they're kind of on the 20 percentile space, not on the 80 percentile space. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But like, there's a scenario here where Donald Trump essentially just doubles the bases on Greenland, effectively declares that they're running Greenland now in exactly the same way they've declared it in Venezuela. And who the fuck is going to respond to that? No one's going to war over Greenland. NATO's not going to mobilize over Greenland. Okay, so NATO collapses, or NATO effectively collapses. Then what? Like I don't think that's not a 1% option in my leaderboard. That's like in the 40 percentile space right now. For me.
I think it's lower than that. But certainly things that were batshit crazy options moved from 1% to 20%.
Like we're they've gone up 2,000% in the probability scale. That still makes them low probability options.
Yes,
but that still makes them low probability options. Sure, I mean if a 1% thing suddenly became a 10% thing, it's still only a 10% thing, but it's gone from an impossible thing to a magnitude more possible, right? Like absolutely. I mean, I think the one thing that Canada has going for it right now is that the more crazy shit that the Americans get into, the more bandwidth gets eaten up by that. So like, look, please let America focus on repurposing Venezuela's oil production for the next 10 years. Good, do that.
Yes.
Stay away from us. By all means, expand that war to Mexico. Have fun. There's a certain point where they will be overextended. And when they're overextended, just in terms of their political bandwidth, they're either going to ignore us or they're going to have to lean back on us as friendly allies. And then we're going to have to decide what to do from that position. But at least we're not enemies at that point, right? There's some factors that are going for us here. All of the factors going for us are bad. Like they're bad for the world, but they're good for us,
I absolutely believe that. Like there's a lot of lemons and some
lemonades.
And
war with Mexico sounds great. Do it, guys. Do it.
I wouldn't say that one, but I would say there's a lot of opportunities for lemonade for Canada in such a geopolitical era. But like on Greenland, even Marco Rubio is saying, we're just going to buy it, guys. Well, they need congressional approval to buy it.
Do they?
Anyway, so
they needed congressional approval for tariffs. They needed congressional approval to do what they did in Venezuela. Legally.
I mean, but the U.S. Treasury has to pay out a check. You know what I mean? I think it is a little bit different. Anyways, so I still, still Greenland still 10. Also, it's like wildly unpopular.
The United States just announced that he's going to increase military spending by 50%.
He can't just do that. He can't.
But do we really think Congress before the next midterms is going to turn down 50%?
They can shut down the government. They can shut down government.
They did.
Hard.
Yeah. They've done it a couple times now.
Anyway. But I just want to say about this lemonade part, though, because I think, if all this money goes into Venezuelan heavy oil, that's almost like great. Like all our competition, all the investment capital we're competing against is going into a black hole now. Like I kind of don't mind. It's like, okay, go ahead, put your money in Venezuela, U.S. oil majors.
So basically you're saying that now's a really good time to be investing in Suncor. Like this is a buying opportunity.
I did. My son is 16, so he uses he has a little Wealthsimple account. I made him buy the dip. I was like, I think this is a really good time. By the time it's asphalt, road building season, I think all these stocks will be back up. But also in general, okay, there's absolutely what will we have for the next 5 or 10 years for sure. More geopolitical disruption, fewer norms, fewer principles. we are at the beginning of a commodity cycle, and that is like this the physical availability of commodities that have not been invested in the last 10 years, and there's more people, so that is a for sure. And again, these are conditions under which Canada could thrive. We are probably the most boring, the safest. We do have all these commodities. The United States is less likely to invade us because it's American money, American people, American companies to some extent. It would disrupt their own supply. So I think we absolutely could go around now and say, hey, do you want a secure supply of energy and resources? We got it. We got your back.
I don't think I'm not worried about an American invasion. Like personally on my leaderboard, that's a sub 1% option. But you want to know what's not a sub 1% option? America throwing a shit ton of dark money into a separatist movement and then using the pretext of some kind of Chinese interference conspiracy story in order to create a kind of moral narrative or a moral conspiracy or a moral pretext for essentially supporting that separatist movement. Like that's not beyond the realm of possibility in order to try and secure Alberta's better access or exclusive access to Alberta's oil sands. That's not low on my probability scale right now. Like it's not 90%, but it ain't 1. The other thing that's not low on my... I also
want to say how this has played out, that they've actually turned Venezuela into a vassal state.
Yeah. And they'll do the same thing with Alberta.
So I feel like separatism, where the idea was, well, the United States will recognize us, the United States will take our oil. Now that you see how that plays out in practice,
the separatists aren't smart though. Like they're not geopolitically sophisticated.
Dumb, Jan. Are Albertans dumb? I mean,
but here's the nightmare scenario here, man. And like, tell me what prevents this when I say like, look, what matters here isn't public opinion. What matters here isn't law. What matters here is power. So let's talk about that. How many $1 billion worth of dark money? What does that do to a referendum? Like if they throw that kind of money into a referendum of 4 million people, what how persuasive does that prove to be? How influential does that prove to be? I can't answer that question.
This all hinges for me at some level on economics. Is Alberta oil going to be cheaper for the United States? You know, if they throw billions of dollars, or are they just getting it as cheap as possible now?
No. The economic argument for doing this isn't there, but this isn't about economics. It's about politics. And again, it's not about economics, it's about power, right? Like
I feel like at one point economics takes over politics. And why? Because money is power at the end of the day.
True, but they have a lot of it and they can piss a lot of it away on just vibes. Yeah. Right? Like if the norms don't exist, let's operate from a position where the norms don't exist. And let's game theory out from that position, right? The other thing that I don't think is beyond the realm of possibility is that there's some kind of Russian action in the Arctic or some kind of false flag Russian operation in the Arctic. The Americans respond. They say Canada can't do shit to defend its Arctic resources, and that's true. We can't at this point due to decades of underinvestment in our military capacities. Perhaps that gets peppered in with a healthy dose of Canada's a major source of fentanyl or Canada's basically run by the Chi-Coms. We need to take over for their own safety and for their own sake. And basically they just plant a bunch of American bases in the Arctic. What are we going to do?
Okay, and this is where I want to get to with this discussion.
And by the way, this is the scenario that Stephen Bannon has explicitly laid out. This isn't batshit crazy territory here. Like, they literally claim to do this. They want to do this. Some aspects do.
You know what they say in the military? Amateurs talk about strategy. Professionals talk about logistics.
That's true.
And right now, it's all amateur hour talking about strategy, Monroe Doctrine, Western 100%. Hemisphere. It's all strategy. There's not an ounce of logistics that is going into any of these things. And this is where I do know about the Arctic. You can't just set up a base, and you can't just take resources. They're under the ground. Like you need to set up a mine. You need to set up a railroad. You need to set up a port. And you're better off just buying it off the market than putting in the money. And it's just sitting there. Anyone could bomb a mine in the Arctic. It's just sitting there like an exposed duck. So logistically, logistically, it is very difficult to do things in the Arctic. People
Very
die.
hard.
People
Very
die
hard.
in the Arctic like this. That's a for sure thing. You need
Hmm.
diesel constantly, and it's
Hmm.
very logistically difficult to have an adequate source of diesel to
Hmm.
warehouse it. And it's also a sitting bomb. Someone can hit your diesel supply, and as a bonus, it blows up. And
Hmm.
so there's nothing to be done in the Arctic of just sticking in a base or just sticking in people that can be done, even the United States military. And that goes for most of Greenland too, by the way.
No, I think that that's totally true. I think that something that we bias toward in Canada, though, is because we don't have the types of money or dynamism to think big and build big. We assume that other people don't either, right? Like, if I asked this question in my column, I said, look, if you had to put if I forced you to put $1,000 on this question tomorrow on Polymarket, America is going to spend $1 trillion stupidly in a basket case Venezuela in order to restore increased access to Venezuelan oil, okay, that it probably doesn't actually need and could get more economically elsewhere. Okay,
Yeah.
that's one scenario, which I think is what they're going to try. Versus, we will build one new pipeline in the next 10 years. If I were to force you to put $1,000 on one of those two outcomes, which one's it going to be?
Absolutely the pipeline. Absolutely
You
the pipeline.
you'd put money on the pipeline?
I would put $10,000 on that question. I'll do it right now.
Oh, you know what? Let's do it.
10-1 odds.
Because this is the optimist versus the pessimist talking here. Because I think that's a
It's
crazy
economics.
bet.
For me,
I think that's a
it's
crazy bet.
rational economics. Rational economics.
I think that's a crazy, because it's not about economics. It's about the politics. We can't build. We can't build a pipeline in this country because of the realities of the legal and political realities.
In the
We
long
just
term,
can't.
like, and that's why pipeline has gone from not popular to popular in the last year and a half. Because
But the increased popularity of the pipeline hasn't made it any more probable. That's what's fucking crazy. Because it doesn't need to be a wildly popular idea. If we're talking about a pipeline through BC, there's too much unceded territory. You could have 99% popular approval for BC in a pipeline, and the 1% that claims sovereignty over the unceded land that the pipeline has to go through can hold that up for 20 years.
It can't, Jen. We just built Coastal GasLink, and we just built Trans Mountain, and now we're building Prince Rupert gas transmission. Like, this has just, that happened under Trudeau, right after the Paris Agreement. The situation in 2026 is 10 times more favorable for building a pipeline through BC than it was in 2018 when Trans Mountain started getting built. So I just, like, I would invest. I'm going to invest in Alberta's northwest coast.
Buy the dip, Jen. Stop being so grim and buy the dip. Stop being so grim and buy the dip.
Not do it. They will never stop the drumbeat. $57, and we're chomping at the bit for this pipeline. You tell me when it's $75, $80, $85. The drumbeat will never stop for building that pipeline until the day it is built.
I look, I tend to agree that, like, it's stupid we don't build the pipeline. I'm pro pipeline. I feel like I've been traumatized by 15 years of covering this, and I've talked to too many people who were involved in pipeline construction, and you see, like, the flashes of horror across their eyes. Like, it's like the idea of going through this again, they just can't bear it. And then you look at Texas, and they're building a new pipeline every 2 years.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not a thing. And it
doesn't need to be so hard. That's why I think it's not a question of if. I think it's a question of how hard are we going to make it on ourselves.
How hard are we going to make it ourselves? And, like, whereas America is clearly an absolute shit show basket case, but it's just so fucking big and wealthy that it can kind of afford to do stupid things that pay off in the long run. And, like, the other thing that I thought, this is something you mentioned before about Venezuela being horrifically corrupt. I think that this is my other question, and I'll ask you about it. But look, most of people in North America and Europe are weird. We're not wired like most of the rest of the world. We tend to be more values driven, yes. And those values driven are very outlier values, right?
Yes.
One of the reasons why I think Trump has actually had comparative success in places like the Middle East is because they talk the same language. Like, it is a highly transactional, ruthlessly non-ideological, pragmatic way of functioning in the world for people like the Saudis or the Qataris or the Emiratis, right? Like, or even the Israelis. They kind of function with this idea of like, corruption. We would call it corruption. I think that they would just be like, we're aligning to incentives. Like, they would take the moral valence out of that way of thinking about the world. They're transactional. And Trump succeeds with these people because he's equally transactional. He's not burdened by some kind of weird Western moral weight. And he functions very effectively with people like Putin and other types of dictators and authoritarians because he understands them. He's like them. And when we assume that Venezuela is going to be a basket case because it's a corrupt shit show basket case, and it is, Trump might be like uniquely positioned to make that work because he's a corrupt basket case. You know what I mean? Like, there's a perverse kind of logic to it that might make it work in a weird way.
So
I'm not saying that's good.
What I don't is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we had the luxury, it's called luxury beliefs. We had the luxury of being in the higher, echelon of the pyramid, because we were secure and our material and physical needs were met. And then you can kind of, think about, art and music and philosophy and higher education and go to school for 20 years, which I did,
Yeah.
But now we've all moved down a rung. And I think post-COVID is when, even Canadians moved down a rung. And that's where you start to say, maybe we should build that pipeline, and even anyway. So that's what reassures me about this pipeline, Jen, is that we have all moved down, and we are all more concerned about the transactions and the material and physical well-being and the safety, but which is to say, there's a couple hundred years of research on this. A corrupt and violent society does not produce better outcomes. It is not in people's self-interest. People prefer not to live in corrupt and violent nations. And that's why you see the immigration flow going in only one direction. Out of those poor, more violent, more corrupt countries where you do have to consider safety, where you do have to consider your physical well-being and your shelter and your food, and you don't get to think about art and going to school and home renovations. And so it is, so I don't think, if you can choose, and the United States, this is the crazy part, they had the choice. They had,
corruption sounds great. Sounds awesome. Let's do more of that.
It's not better for most people. And so we will see, how strong, I think we've all been surprised by how weak American institutions have turned out to be in the last year. But are they strong enough to, again, when public opinion moves, will they be strong enough to resist this? I still think they will be. I still think that arc, I think it's out of people's self-interest. It's not more fun to be in a poor, more violent, more unstable situation.
So here's again, I'm really enjoying this conversation because I feel like we're balancing off one another, and you're forcing me to examine my own doomerism, and I appreciate that. So I'm enjoying it, but I'm playing with it a little bit because I would say yes, I totally agree. The history has shown us that corrupt societies are weak societies, authoritarian societies are brittle societies, and they don't do as well in the long run as liberal high value societies. Okay, I agree with that. But there's like a tiny little exception to that rule. And the tiny little exception is that transition period, right? When you go from being a high trust society that is functional and liberal to a corrupt one, the people who first make that shift and take advantage of the opportunities that corruption suddenly affords, that little brief window, people can make huge amounts of money and do very, very well in that. And I think you saw that in places like Russia, for example, right? And then as the entire society as a whole calcifies into corruption, then, the collapse happens, and then the living standards start to fall apart, and then the society becomes weaker and more brittle. But if you're in kind of in a high trust society and you're the first monkey to decide that being evil is a beneficial thing to be in a high trust environment,
yes,
you're going to do well. It's the second and third evil monkey who starts to suffer, right? But the first evil monkey is the one that potentially gets all the benefits of the high trust society and is able to prey upon his fellow peers to the greatest extent because of that trust. And then as the collective adapts to that new level of corruption to everybody's detriment, then the incentives start to decline. But that first evil monkey is the one that makes out like a bandit. And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing in America. This is like the first evil monkey generation, right?
So I do agree with that Trump is taking advantage of, whether it's complacency or trust, and trying to profit from it. I think that, even like the meme coins and that kind of thing. Like,
sure,
that was
yeah, just
happening. But
the fact that that's even a thing that's happening.
But we think about this too. And you mentioned game theory, and
sure.
And in game theory, it is about, that single transaction. You're all hunting the same deer. You're better off if you hunt, as a group of 4 or 5. But maybe one of you sees a rabbit and says, I'm going to go eat this rabbit by myself. Screw those guys. They missed the deer. This is kind of So if there's a single transaction, yes, you may be better off. Your incentive is to not play along, to not follow the rules, to not engage in cooperation. But if you think there will be any more transactions after that, you're incentivized to play along, to have a set of rules and to cooperate and to be trusted by your gang. And so in the short term, this may work out for Trump and the administration of the network. In the medium term, it will not work out for the United States. And I don't think if they are committing, crimes, which I think a lot of them are, I think there is still a system in place that can punish them for their crimes, or at least the reputation will be destroyed if they aren't, actually, arraigned. And so all of this, yes, in the short term, Trump is exploiting, but in the medium term, I still think there will be consequences.
I actually agree with that. The question, I think, is the difference between the optimist and the pessimist mindset, which I think we're demonstrating really effectively here, is how long is the medium term, right? Mm-hmm. Because look, are the consequences going to come forward for the guy who goes off and gets the rabbit? Do the consequences for him come the next day, or do the consequences come for him 20 years later, right? Like I don't know whether or not the American institutions are strong enough and can recover enough fast enough to give me an optimistic medium-term outlook. I think that in the long term, like if we're talking like on a 50-year scale or even a 20-year scale, yeah, I think America will bounce back from this particular place and they're going to hit rock bottom and then they're going to be like, shit, we can't do that again. And you're going to see some reforms come out of this period. I genuinely believe that. But I might be dead before that happens.
I don't know. I feel like in our society, because of social media, the good and the bad, you can impose social costs on these wild disregard for norms and principles. You can impose social consequences on that very quickly. And I'll say we always see that with Stephen Miller. He will be portrayed and is being portrayed as the evil Darth. There's very heavy social costs being imposed on him for his one rant, for his role. And obviously Trump has been more insulated from those costs. But Trump is, the head of a gang and everyone underneath him is going to be exposed. I think to social and economic, ultimately economic costs.
And hopefully legal sanctions as well. But the problem is, like, I just don't think Stephen Miller cares. I think that they've discovered that shamelessness is a superpower, that their indifference to social consequences gives them extraordinary power to function. Again, going back to the evil monkey hypothesis, if you stop giving a shit about the well-being of the entire group of monkeys as a collective, and you just embrace indifference and lack of shame, you can function as the first evil monkey quite effectively for a really long time.
He'll become a liability to Trump, a political liability.
Yeah, and then he gets replaced, with someone worse.
That's what I'm saying.
But then he gets But then he
There
gets
are
replaced with
cops.
someone worse, right? Like there's always going to be someone worse than Stephen Miller,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, even the person who eventually replaces Trump's not going to live forever.
You
He's
know,
still
and
going to
I'm
be playing to the same incentives.
I think I'm a big, supporter of the, pendulum theory.
I am
it's
too.
going
I am
too
too.
far, and there will be a correction, and there will be an appetite for the Obama or the Reagan to come and speak to people about the greatness of the American people.
I
And that will
agree.
be attractive. So I guess we're talking about time frame, and
No,
honestly,
I'm also a believer in pendulum theory. I think pendulum theory is real. I think I've seen that play out in my life, even in the last 5 years. The question is like how much further across the board does the pendulum go before it starts to swing back? That is an unknowable unknown, man. Like, have we hit rock bottom? Is this rock bottom? I don't think it's rock bottom.
I think it's rock bottom. I feel like you've seen more vocal opposition from Republican representatives this week than we have. But frankly, there was some with Canadian tariffs, and then that the Americans do like Canadians, and they didn't like tariffs on Canadians, and it was bad for some Republican districts, and some Republican senators and congressmen said so because it was bad for their own district. And Trump did come back. We did respect Kuzma in the end. He didn't tariff energy and potash and uranium. And so there have been some holds on Trump's power and his ability to just unilaterally do whatever he wants. And I feel like because Venezuela is likely to be a disaster, it won't be that difficult politically for Republican representatives to hold him to account in the next month.
Do Americans like Canadians?
Because I think
increasingly,
they do.
Because I watch American media talk about Canada.
You watch right-wing influencers talk about Canada.
I do, but right-wing influencers are, influencers. They influence people. And I hear Tucker Carlson saying that or implying that America is mating people for organs. And I hear an underlying conspiracy that all of Canada is effectively being run by the Chinese communists through the Liberal Party. And I hear that we're now responsible for fentanyl deaths in the United States. And I hear them looking at us going like, you guys have gone woke. You're fucking nuts now.
Jen, they're watching a Canadian TV show about two gay hockey players.
I don't think that's gonna save us. I don't think the gay hockey players are gonna save us, man.
I think it's an indicator that they're not all Canadian, hateful, woke hating. But also
all. The question is, are there enough of them?
And we needed to be shaken out of our complacency a little bit too.
We got like I don't think anyone is arguing for a return to like the 2021s. Okay, like I think we're happy that pendulum's swinging in the other direction. I'm good with it. I'm good. I'm very happy about that. I just when I see the way that Canada is depicted by both left-wing and right-wing media in America, I see two very different pictures. I see completely exaggerated that we have become the poster child for wokeism, and we are now basically they used to think of us as cousins or siblings, and now they can't recognize us anymore. We're too fucking nuts for them. We're exemplars of like the worst of Portlandia. And we're not like them anymore. Or I see the left-wing media that presents us as being like, but we have free healthcare and everything is this beautiful utopia here in Canada. And neither of these pictures is rooted in a nuanced or grounded understanding of the good and the bad of this country. Right?
And Jen, but you'll surely agree that in actual fact, the average American is apathetic and does not think about.
No, that's true. The average American doesn't give a shit about us at all. That's right. No, that's fair. That's fair.
100 years of thinking of Mounties and mountains, and they went to Niagara Falls. Fine. That will be 60% of them at least.
Okay, I think that's 60%. But to some extent, that's also a problem because that means that we have no constituency. There's no one going to the bat for us.
It's very hard to change. That is a glacier. It's a glacier mentality that American people have about Canada, and it's very hard to change such such a grounded, long-term idea, conception And they've had interactions with Canadians, and they've gone whatever, Tim Hortons donut, or they watch hockey games or something, or they know, that, some comedians are Canadian. That glacier is so hard to change. It is so ingrained at this point that we are friends. And again, like, I don't even think the average American is looking at Venezuela all that much either.
No, like Venezuela is not going to be dictating the midterm outcomes. Like, the foreigners aren't real people to them. I get it. But the concern is, like, to some extent, the 60% friendly apathy almost scares me more, because what that tells me is, like, there's no constituency for our interests down there. No one's going to bat for Canada to try and keep us from being tariffed to shit. Like,
I mean,
there's nobody,
tariffed to shit. Because
they're not willing to expend real political capital on our behalf.
They kind of did, because everyone in Michigan,
they whined a little bit, but ultimately the stuff that's not getting tariffed is the stuff that Americans don't produce and don't need, and actually need. It's oil, it's potash, it's aluminum. Like, it's the stuff that America doesn't produce is the stuff that we got free on tariffs. Like, their tariff strategy is still fundamentally self-interested. And if a couple of senators spoke up on our behalf, who cares? I mean, nobody's actually willing to expend real political capital because their interest, no American operates in our interest. There's no incentive there.
It is not in their interest. And manufacturing is in decline. And that's not just Canadian tariffs, that's all the tariffs. But it is hitting hard. And Americans just need to feel enough economic pain. And we know this in Canada. You just have to feel enough economic pain that the public opinion starts to switch, and politicians have to start saying different stories. And it's not in Americans' interest to have tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada. They can't replace that. Auto parts, They can't replace that in the short term. And so it's just pain that they're feeling from those extra costs right now.
And I just think that the easy way for them to respond to that isn't to reduce the tariffs. It's just to be like, well, it's the Canadians' fault. You just scapegoat. That's it.
Some of that will happen for sure. Yeah, some of that is happening, but I don't know. Again, that the average person doesn't care about politics that much, but the economy around them isn't as good as it was. You can't misinform on whether your economy is good or not. At some point, it's just people at the grocery store, and at the gas pump. And again, that's
the Chi-Com's doing it.
That's the one thing. Chi-Com's. Yeah,
it's the Chinese. It's the Chinese fault that your groceries went up. It's the Canadians' fault the groceries went up. They're tariffing your whiskey and your cheese.
Why aren't they doing something about it? That will be that, if we're so powerful and we love America, why are we letting the Canadians and the Chinese do this? Fix it.
Well, we're working on making them the 51st state. You just wait and see. Look, I've loved this conversation. Thank you so much for coming in and being a ray of sunshine to my dark misanthropic dark doomerism. I've enjoyed it so much, Heather. Where can people find you?
You can find me on X, which most of us call Twitter still, at Exner-Pirot, and MacDonald-Laurier Institute. You can see everything I write and everything all my colleagues write for free. There's no paywalls there on that website.
Fantastic. And also, you're a subscriber to the line. Thank you very much for being a subscriber.
I subscribed on the very first day, so I think I was
amazing. Well, Heather, thank you again for your time.
I'm on the list.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Please join us again in the future, particularly as I imagine more news is going to happen that's in your wheelhouse in the coming months. So I'm sure we're going to have you over again, and I'm going to see if I can turn you over to the dark side. We'll see. We'll see.
No, I'm telling you, this is the time for Canada to shine. We can make some moves right now.
Cool. Excellent. All right. Thanks, and like and subscribe, and check us out at www.readtheline.ca.